How reliable are our dates for the four canonical Gospels? Hi, everybody. I'm Robyn Walsh. I'm a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity, and I'm part of the Bart Ehrman team. Today, I want to talk about the dates that scholars traditionally give to the four canonical Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So Mark is usually considered the earliest. Let's start with him. And he's dated to around 70 CE. The reason that date is important is because it is when the temple in Jerusalem falls during what is traditionally referred to as the Jewish War, or the First Jewish Revolt, which took place between about 66 and 73. In 70, and we have this attested in many sources, the temple in Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans, specifically the Flavian family. And the spoils from that sacking of the temple, including things like the menorah that had been held there and all of the riches inside of that temple. And by the way, temples in antiquity were kind of like banks. They were a place where you would store precious materials. They were all marched through the streets of Rome as a triumph and used to actually build what's called the Arch of Titus. And we'll show a picture of it here that commemorates this triumph and the menorah going through the streets of Rome with the spoils, as well as what we know today as the Colosseum, which was referred to in antiquity as the Flavian Amphitheater. The reason that that date becomes important for Mark is that in Mark 13, there is a description of Jesus predicting the fall of the temple. And so scholars have concluded that that description in Mark 13 suggests that whoever the author of Mark was had some knowledge of that temple's destruction. So that is usually why, along with the fact that Mark, we think, was used by Matthew and Luke as source material, and his gospel tends to be a little bit shorter. The sentences are shorter, the structure is shorter. He doesn't go into a great deal of detail in the way that Matthew and Luke do, especially Luke. And Matthew also goes to great pains to really explain Jesus' teachings. Mark is happy for you to be a little bit confused. So that truncated style, along with Mark 13 and the references to that war, scholars will put Mark right at the fall of the temple. How do I feel about that? Maybe I'll save that all for the end, a longer discourse on that. But I'll say that putting it right at 70 is really the earliest you can go. I think that, you really are accommodating there the idea that maybe there might have been an oral tradition or something like that that predated Mark actually being written down, but we also don't have great evidence for that. So I would say that 70 is as generous as we can be. After that, usually Matthew comes next, and he's usually dated to around 80. And this is more or less because scholars presume that it would take about a decade for the Gospel of Mark to circulate widely enough. And remember, publishing in antiquity was something not like today. It didn't happen in mass production. If you wanted to read something, you had to have somebody copy it at great expense and labor. So the idea there is that Mark was maybe circulating, whoever Matthew was got a hold of it, wanted to either write his own version, write maybe a better version in his mind, or maybe explain some of the aspects of Mark he thought were confusing. And so he takes Mark as source material and produces his own gospel. So scholars give that, again, about 10 years as a process in time. But that's purely speculation and really just kind of a guesstimation of how long it might take for that to get into Matthew's hands. Similarly, Luke is dated about 10 years after that, so maybe 80 to 90, giving him a little bit of time to get a hold of Mark and what other source materials he may have had. In his preface, he talks about having talked to some people who may have been eyewitnesses. That might have been more rhetorical than actual, but he does say that he consulted a lot of different sources to write his piece. So about 90 for his production. And then John, which has very different teachings, a very different style, a bit more philosophical, you might even say, than the other Gospels, a little bit more, some people would even say theological in its tenor and its descriptions of Jesus' status. That is usually dated later to maybe the late 1st century, early 2nd century. The irony with that is that he's actually, the Gospel of John, our earliest scraps of papyri of the New Testament are actually of John. So interesting there that that's the case. But John is usually considered something of an outlier, although some scholars do debate this, and dated to a much later kind of theology. So that's the general landscape of how we date the Gospels. What do I think of that? I think it needs a rethink. I think that as a starting point, it's not bad. And I would say that I'm comfortable with it being post-war, the dating. I think that all of the Gospels are post-war, post that Jewish war, not because of Mark 13 per se, but mostly because the kind of practices that Jesus promotes in the Gospels through his teachings, although he as a young man does things like go to the temple, he otherwise does not require the temple to be a part of what we might consider the Jesus movement or early Christianity. In fact, he sort of presents a version or an interpretation of the Jewish scriptures and of, we might even say, a form of Judaism that doesn't require the temple. So something that would have been very relevant to a period of time after the fall of the temple, obviously. So I think that something about the fall of that temple inspired the production of the Gospels. Maybe people thought this could have been the end of the world. This could have been when Jesus would return, and he didn't. So let's go back and think about his life and his teachings. What did we miss? And I also think that it presented, again, a version of Jesus's teachings and a way to carry forward that did not require something like sacrifice at the temple. So in my mind, the temple is gone by the time the Gospels are written. But whether or not they are late first century, early second century, because our manuscript tradition is really just so late. And I really recommend the work of Brent Nongbury on this if you haven't seen already. His book, God's Library, goes through a lot of our early manuscript traditions and the papyri that we have. Because it's so late, I think we're being very generous by placing Mark, for example, as early as we do. I hope this was interesting. If you are captivated by this subject as I am, whether you're a newbie or a nerd like me, you can check out the BSA, the Biblical Studies Academy. It's at bartehrman.com/BSA learning. You can sign up. There are a bunch of people there, discussion boards, courses that you can take on these subjects. And people that you can talk to and explore your interests. You can sign up for a 14-day free trial. Again, that's bartehrman.com/BSA learning. Hope to see you there. Thanks.